Biden administration must deliver on its promise to end the forever wars. You touched on that. That's Afghanistan. Where else do we need to pull back? I mean, Afghanistan, we have now, it's interesting. Trump tried to take off the table, I guess, half our forces there, which would be about 2,500, if I'm not mistaken. And there was, broad pushback on this, in part because it's Trump, or ostensibly because it was Trump, but maybe because of other reasons. Where else do we need to disengage? And what does that disengagement look like? I mean, do we just leave Afghanistan? What does that say to our NATO allies? Although we'll get to NATO is another question as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've got a forever war framework via the war on terror that spans across a good portion of the globe, the greater Middle East, North Africa, Afghanistan included in there. The U.S. has ground troops, not just in Afghanistan, but also in Iraq still, Syria, and Somalia. And I think the Biden administration, not just to secure our interests and protect our people, but also to restore a modicum of credibility where the American people should bring those conflicts to a close in a clear way over the course of its 4 years. It really would not be a good thing if the next candidate can run saying, Joe Biden has prosecuted the forever war still, and there's just overwhelming support. About 3/4 of the American public, which doesn't agree on very much, agrees that U.S. troops should come home from Afghanistan and Iraq. That's just an overwhelming number. So I think to restore some health to our own democracy, and by the way, not create the sense of, keep feeding this sense of existential fear that, we have enemies out there that want to kill us, and that's why we've got to kill them. This is incredibly important to bring those conflicts to a close, and it should be done responsibly. But in the case of Afghanistan, the United States has made an agreement with the Taliban, and U.S. troops are supposed to fully come home at the end of April. And I actually think that if Trump had been able to bring U.S. troops fully home from Afghanistan, it would have done Biden a favor and avoided Biden having to make now some difficult decisions. But, it's just unimaginable to me how the United States now, with a very small capacity, is fundamentally going to change the balance of power on the ground in Afghanistan.
Right.
We just cannot expect that we're going to lose a war, fight a war for 20 years, not be successful in achieving our grandiose goals, and then refuse to leave until conditions are ideal on the ground. They're not going to be ideal. It was the right thing to end the war in Vietnam. It did lead to the North's takeover of Vietnam. But we have to be able to live with the consequences and get what we need. And what we need is to make sure that Afghanistan does not become a haven from which the United States is targeted by terrorists. And that's something, we should evaluate, just as we evaluate threats from terrorism elsewhere, without continuing to be a participant in the violence in Afghanistan.
Well, I mean, I've forgotten now. Like, what was ostensibly our mission in Afghanistan? I mean, I remember, when bin Laden was in Tora Bora, and we were surrounded him and then let him go, essentially, because we had to put people into Iraq. But what was and I remember there was a brief moment where people were talking about women's rights in Afghanistan, and putting in a democratically elected government there that is going to be in charge of not just Kabul, but everywhere. But we didn't put any resources into that country beyond our military, it seems to me. Like, I don't remember the big project to build all the roads
or build schools
I think at one point we were painting them. But I don't that ended, it seems to me, 15 years ago. And we've just been there, maybe keeping the Taliban from taking over a certain part of the country at any given point. I mean, is that basically what the mission has been? And that doesn't seem to be doing, like you say, I guess it doesn't seem to be doing anything.
Well, the release of the Afghanistan papers last year revealed just how skeptical most senior officials and military leaders have been that the United States could achieve its objective in Afghanistan almost from the beginning. I mean, the initial objective is actually something I support. Look, the United States was attacked on 9/11. The enemy was Al Qaeda. The United States then set out to decimate Al Qaeda and also punish the Taliban government for harboring Al Qaeda. That makes sense. That goal was quickly achieved. Unfortunately, we did not get the leader of Al Qaeda, bin Laden, but nevertheless, Al Qaeda was hurt badly. It was quickly achieved. And so instead of saying, okay, if we don't pull back now, we'll never have a coherent reason to pull back. We continued and expanded the mission to nation building, making exactly who believed that we were going to turn Afghanistan into a liberal democracy is an interesting question, and when those beliefs waxed and waned. But we've actually, made considerable efforts. It's not exactly for want of trying. The Obama administration implemented a major surge of troops in Afghanistan and caught bin Laden. So there was another off-ramp to say, hey, we have achieved our mission. If we don't stop this now, when is it going to end? But unfortunately, that off-ramp was not taken. And so here we are with a war that basically nobody can defend. I mean, the Taliban keeps gaining ground. Nobody is seriously proposing in Washington to come up with a creative, strategy backed by significant new resources to really change the equation. We're afraid to leave.
How much do we need Congress to act in this instance? Like, I mean, if they revoke the AUMF could they end this, or is it just a question of like our government is structured in such a way that the president has so much more ability to impact foreign policy, even without, broad statutory authority, that there's a much better chance of, because you don't have as many different political, influences for the president to simply make a decision and do this?
You're right that the president has broad discretion. And if the president truly wants to order a withdrawal, the president can certainly do that, which is important to keep in mind in the case of Trump. Despite all the rhetoric about withdrawals, when those withdrawals don't happen, it bespeaks a lack of will on the part of the president.
Saying we're going to withdraw multiple times throughout his presidency, and there's always some back channel which gets them out of it. That's
right. But Congress can absolutely step up always and do its job. I mean, it's in the Constitution. Congress is supposed to declare war. Now, we haven't declared war since World War II, but we do have an authorization for the use of force from 2001, which the president is still using. Congress ought to repeal that and replace it with a much more limited authorization that specifies the location, specifies the enemy, and has sunset provisions. So Congress has to face this question and do their job again and again. Plus, Congress does ultimately control the purse strings.
Right. All right. Well, you also argue that number 3 is to stop policing the Middle East, which I think is, we've touched on. In my mind, to say that our policing of the Middle East has been a function of our security is sort of a second order thing. To me, it's more about maintaining our hegemony, which, arguably some people say we need for our security. I don't know. I mean, there's seems to me like, a lot of other countries out there that have shown that you don't need to have hegemony to have security. But in fact, maybe the rest of the country of the world,
all countries,
right? But be that as it may, let's jump to the you call for Biden to resist NATO expansion. Let's roll that into China as well, because there was a story out today that in the Wall Street Journal talking about a report that was commissioned by the NATO Secretary General, that its focus should change to China. And certainly there are three data points I have on this and the whole turn to China. One is going back 20 years ago, Gary Hart, I interviewed shortly after, back in 2004, and he told a story. He sat on a committee about threats to United States. He and I think it was maybe Rudman chaired a 21st century U.S. security threat commission. On the first meeting, they went around the table with 20 people. What's their threat? All of them said, and this was in the summer of 2000, I think, non-state actors, essentially like Al-Qaeda. One person said China. Everybody laughed. They reconvened 3 or 4 months later. Same thing. China. That person never came back again. That person was Lynn Cheney. And then we have the pivot, which was both on a commercial side, the TPP to isolate China. And I was telling Emma, I got held over on a flight in LA. I went down to the USS Iowa and walked in to look at where our bases were, our Pacific. And the guy working there said that we had moved all of our naval operations to the Pacific in anticipation of trying to contain China. I was like, I didn't know that. He's, oh, yeah. And that's happened under the Obama administration. What's going on with our perspective on China? NATO's now attempting to get involved. Where should we be, and where should Joe Biden go, and where do you think we're headed?
That's very interesting about NATO, because Europe has been, and I think continues to be, quite divided on the China question. The United States under Trump has been pushing Europe to be more anti-China than some people have wanted to go. So we'll see about NATO. Is NATO fit for purpose to be a bulwark against China is a good question as a North Atlantic security organization, but it's always searching for a new purpose after the fall of the Soviet Union. So maybe this will give it something coherent to do. I'm really concerned about the tenor of U.S.-China relations. And we talked about the shift toward...
I mean, do we need a bulwark against China? I mean, like, in what way and why?
Well, look, China poses a number of challenges. It has been coercive in the use of economic diplomacy, particularly in its own region. Look at the way it punished Australia concerning Australia's objections to Chinese transparency vis-a-vis the virus. Mm-hmm. Its human rights abuses are terrible, no doubt about it, right? And we do have economic competition. But the military threat from China has been massively inflated by members of both political parties. I do not go to bed at night worried that China is going to attack this country.
Stephen, do you think that has to do with the economic competition, the desire to ramp up that kind of rhetoric in order to get the public behind more aggressive economic action, whatever that may be?
Yeah, I think that voters who are anti-China, they're thinking of their jobs, their communities, and they're blaming China for that, or they're blaming deals that we've made, right? And that makes sense. But the people in Washington who are looking for, I'm afraid, a way to keep the defense budget healthy, which is to say more than half of our federal discretionary budget year after year, are using every objection against China, including legitimate objections, lumping that together with this sense of military threat. But hardly anyone believes China is about to invade South Korea, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, U.S. allies. It has increased its military capabilities roughly in line with the growth of its economy over the past several decades. And what I really fear is that the United States just cannot say no to trying to be the dominant military power in the Indo-Pacific region. And it's just going to view any expansion of Chinese military capability as a threat to itself, when in fact that's maybe a threat to the U.S. ability to operate militarily, but not a threat to the United States or the vital interests of the American people. We actually have an opportunity right now with China to focus on the things that matter most to the American people and the planet: climate change, pandemic disease. These things call for more cooperation, not harsher confrontation. And we know also, I think we have a period of time at least. It may be that China gets more aggressive in a military sense later on as it rises. That is possible. And that's a legitimate worry. But it doesn't have the forces or the desire to go on some sort of military rampage. So we have time to take a step back, allow the countries, our partners, allies, and others in the region who are more threatened than we are by the possibility of future Chinese aggression to judge these threats for themselves, spend more money on their military if they think the threat requires it, form coalitions to counterbalance China. We could play some role in facilitating those counterbalancing coalitions as well. But we have time. But I'm afraid that what most of the national security community wants to do is put ourselves on the front line, not prudently wait and assess the threat and let others take the initiative.
Is that simply just a function of like, there's money to be made? I mean, I'm talking specifically in the massive military budget. I mean, it's harder now for me to sort of like wrap my head around the interplay between the military and the economics. Like, in the 20th century, maybe the earlier part, and certainly the 19th century, I could see like, well, you need a navy because you need your shipping lanes to be open. But where does that interplay exist now in the context of China? Like, why are we putting so many ships in the Pacific? I mean, I understand they got to go somewhere, and maybe they're just like, well, there's nowhere else to put them.
We got so many.
But we could also decommission a bunch of them, and we could do that. But what is the interplay, if there is any? And I certainly, I think it's another episode of the program to talk about. Let's have our supply lines. Let's not be so contingent upon what's going on in China for our supply lines. Let's have some redundancy, et cetera, et cetera. But putting that aside, like what is even the justification for this other than to say like, they're Chinese, they could be coming after us?
Well, there you go. That's the justification, basically. But I think there's no question that the concentrated interests are a tremendous problem. It's why the massive military budgets are must-pass items in Congress year after year. I think the specter of competing with China also solves a problem if you want to keep this general U.S. role in the world going right now, precisely because China is actually not so reckless in its use of military power. Not many people think that we're going to get into a war with China in the near term. So if you're looking at calls among the American public and even political leaders to, end endless war, a weariness of military intervention, well, here you've got an opponent that, we can spend a lot of money in the name of deterrence. And if there's going to be a conflict, we're kicking that can down the road. That's probably not going to happen for a while. Now, meanwhile, just as in the first Cold War, we may come back into the Middle East and fight proxy wars in the global South, which will be endless wars again. But, for now, it's a nice fantasy to imagine that we will discipline ourselves and engage in a more strategic competition, and deterrence will always work. The problem is that by, again, putting ourselves on the front line, we are eliminating the incentive for others to step up, judge threats for themselves, and, maybe ultimately China doesn't feel so threatened as a result, and there's greater peace and prosperity in that region, and certainly in the United States.
So in other words, in some ways, China's a great boogeyman because they're never going to come out of the closet and actually attack us. And we can just, we can just generate a lot of cash for a certain group of people. And it's low, I guess, jeopardy, except for the fact that we're just burning all this cash. And who knows what happens when you make all these military machines, people want to use them.
Yeah, and we're, creating antagonism with the world's number 2 power. Meanwhile, the planet's burning. China's the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. We can have a Green New Deal at home and get our emissions down to zero. That will not solve the planetary problem of climate change. You need China, and China's been the number 1 developer of green technologies in many areas, including electric vehicles, solar panels. So if we were really concerned about, let's say, climate change, leaving aside pandemic disease as a national security threat, maybe that would be our priority instead of potentially creating military antagonisms between the world's number 1 and number 2 powers.
Well, Stephen Wertheim, from your mouth to Joe Biden's ears and those around him, thank you so much for joining us today. Folks should check out your book, Tomorrow the World. We will put a link to your book and to the piece in Foreign Policy at majority.fm. Thanks again.
Terrific. Thank you.